and also the presentation slides will be posted to our Conserve North Texas website, conservenorthtexas.org, following the event, and I'll also be sending those out in a follow-up email, so you and anyone who wasn't able to join us this morning will have access to all of the information and to the video recording. I also want to give a shout out to our workshop sponsors and partners. We're put this together as part of our deliverables under our State Energy Conservation Office grant, SECO, which helps fund a lot of the energy related work that we do here at the COG. But really this meeting came out of conversations with the leadership of our RISE Coalition, which is the Regional Integration of Sustainability Efforts group. If you might not be familiar, our chair and vice chair, Kat Barnett from the city of Denton and Mendy White from the city of Louisville, we're receiving a lot of feedback from other communities in the region about interest in this, these various funding opportunities, and just wanted to know how they could best be supported in applying for these opportunities. So really the RISE Coalition pushed for us to put together a little roundtable session so all of our communities in our region can kind of talk together, collaborate, and some of our smaller communities or folks who may not have applied for this type of funding before can get some feedback and some guidance from some of our more practiced communities about how they're planning to utilize this funding. So again, thank you and big shout out to Catherine and Mendy for their support in this. And if you're interested in learning more about our energy work or our RISE Coalition, information is here on the slide. So with that, we'll kind of get into our agenda for the meeting. First, we're going to do a quick run through of a lot of the available energy and climate pollution reduction grant opportunities that are available at the federal level, either right now or coming up later this year. Garrett and Savannah are going to help me out and speak to some of those funding opportunities, what kind of projects are eligible and how folks can apply. And then I'm hoping we can spend a good portion of the meeting just kind of having an open roundtable discussion so folks can kind of brainstorm and think through how they might access this funding. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and I will now hand it over to Garrett Colony in our transportation department at COG to talk about our first funding opportunity.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Garrett. I'm going to talk about the Department of Energy's Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program first. The DOE's EECBG Formula Funding Program is now accepting applications. They'll be accepting applications on a rolling basis through January 2024, but the first opportunity to apply ends this month, April 28th. You can see the EECBG application hub, which is linked in the slide, to find out if your entity is eligible for funding, if you've been allocated funding. I've got the list pulled up on my computer. If anyone isn't sure if their local government has been allocated funding, I could let you know today, and I encourage everybody, if you've been allocated funding, to apply this month. Some eligible activities under the EECBG program include energy planning, renewable energy, electric vehicles, community electric infrastructure, and workforce development. The community electric infrastructure includes EV charging stations, as well as things like upgrades to traffic signals and more. The EECBG site has a detailed overview of the program, as well as answers to frequently asked questions, information on upcoming and past webinars they've held, and info on office hours. The office hours that the DOE is holding for this program will be bi-weekly. They started this week, I believe, and they will provide info only on the formula grant process. You will have to sign up on the website to attend those. Some upcoming webinars that the DOE has regarding the formula funding program. One will cover the voucher program, and the other will cover the technical assistance that the DOE offers for the EECBG program. You can find the links to those webinars in the slides, which will be sent out afterwards. There's also going to be a competitive program under the EECBG program that will open soon, and it will be used to distribute the remaining 8.8 million in grants through a competitive process to units of local government ineligible under the formula grant option. So if you've been allocated funding under the formula option, you won't be eligible for the competitive grants. There is an upcoming EECBG webinar on the competitive grant process on April 18th. The link to register is again in the slides. I also want to mention the preliminary energy assessments, or PEA, offered from the State Energy Conservation Office, or SECO. SECO provides free technical assistance to local governments. This free preliminary energy assessment can be requested by completing a simple one-page request form. The link to that request form is in the slides. I think this is a great first step that you can take to identify some activities to implement using the EECBG funding. Okay, next we'll talk about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or BIL. The IIJA will provide $558 billion in funding and new federal funding for projects ranging from transportation infrastructure to resilience, broadband expansion, and more. Information on programs and funding opportunities available under this can be found at the resources below, but I did want to highlight a couple of them. One of them was the EECBG program, which we just talked about, but there's also the Energy Improvement in Rural or Remote Areas. This is a program to improve the overall cost effectiveness of energy generation, transmission, and distribution systems in rural and remote areas. There will also be grants for energy improvements at public school facilities. That is a program that will provide competitive grants to make energy efficiency, renewable energy, and alternative fueled vehicle upgrades and improvements at public schools. So ISDs would be eligible to apply for that. And then some resources available for the IIJA. The whitehouse.gov website, linked in the slide, provides a guidebook that lists all of the available programs under the Act, as well as other resources like the funding opportunity schedule, fact sheets, and more, and maps of progress. And then there are a couple other resources. The National Association of State Energy Officials Infrastructure Act Resource Hub has a lot of good resources related to all of the programs available under this Act. And then our own air quality funding webpage has more detailed information on the programs available. The Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. The IRA provides $369 billion in funding for energy and climate related projects. It offers several tax credits as well as grant and rebate programs. On this slide, we'll talk about a few of the tax credits available. First, there are clean energy credits for residential use, the energy efficient home improvement credit, residential clean energy tax credit, and energy efficient new homes tax credit. There's also non-residential clean energy tax credits available. So the ITC investment tax credit, the ITC will provide a tax credit for 1% of the project cost, and that tax credit is usually used for solar projects or clean energy technology projects. There's also the PTC, or production tax credit. That tax credit is per unit of energy generated over 10 years, and that is usually used for wind energy projects or by wind energy facilities. And then there's the transportation credits. So there's an EV tax credit available, as well as qualified commercial clean vehicles, alternative fuel refueling property, and renewable fuel credits. Some additional tax credits available under the IRA, there are some additional tax credits available, including for clean hydrogen and carbon capture technology. More information on the available tax credits can be found at the resources listed below. Again, there's a guidebook for the IRA available on the White House website that lists all of the tax credits and grant and rebate options available.
Thank you for
under the
calling.
IRA.
Please continue to hold.
There's also a list of all the tax credits available on the IRS website, which is linked on the slide, and some more information on our air quality funding website. So I also want to mention some of the grant and rebate programs available under the IRA. Again, the White House Guidebook provides a full list of all of the programs available. There will be several grant and rebate programs: the Clean Heavy Duty Vehicle Grant and Rebates, Environmental and Climate Justice Block Grants, and several more. So I encourage you to look at the full list. Some of those are linked in the slide if you want to find out more about any of those. Now, this isn't an IRA program, but like the Preliminary Energy Assessment offered by CECO, the Clean Energy to Communities, or C2C program, peer learning cohorts may be a good program to take advantage of as you determine priorities and apply for some of this funding. The C2C program is funded by the DOE and managed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, with support from the World Resources Institute. The peer learning cohorts are multi-community engagements that allow collaborative learning, sharing, and planning to accelerate the clean energy transition. There's a link to the program website available in the slides. I'd encourage you all to look into that, as well as the PEA, as you're considering what to use all of this funding for and applying for the funding. And now I'm going to hand it over to Savannah Nance so she can discuss the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund.
Yeah, thanks, Garrett. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us on a Friday. So I'm here to talk about two programs that were created by the Inflation Reduction Act, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and the Climate Pollution Reduction Grants Program. And both of these programs are a little bit different. They're new and they are a little, strange, just compared to normal grant programs. So we just wanted to make sure you guys were aware of them and the potential that they offer to your community to help reduce energy usage. So the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is supposed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution, but it is supposed to do so by providing grants to eligible recipients who then subgrant that funding to your small businesses, individual households, and then communities. So the first one, the General and Low Income Disadvantaged Communities Competition, has $20 billion available, and that funding is supposed to go to nonprofits who then make the grants available to small businesses and individuals. So for your community and your city to be able to access those funds, you would have to find a nonprofit partner to apply. The second Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund program is actually the Zero Emissions Technology Competition, which has $7 billion available in funding. And that can be directly awarded to a municipality who then subgrants it out to their citizens, or it could be awarded to a state or a nonprofit as well. And even though it says zero emission technologies, it's really just for solar and then storage for the community. Both of these programs are supposed to open in summer of 2023, and there's not a lot of details about them yet because the EPA is still developing the program. But I do encourage you to go to the website that is linked, if someone can put it in the chat, because you should be able to sign up for updates for the program. Next slide. The next program wanted to talk about is the Climate Pollution Reduction Grants. And if you're someone that has heard me talk about this before, I apologize. But this is a new program that was also created by the Inflation Reduction Act. that is supposed to help also reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other harmful air pollutions. And that includes criteria pollutants, ozone precursors, air toxics, anything like that. And this is going to be a 2-phase program. For the first phase, there is $250 million in non-competitive planning grants available. And that money has been split by the EPA between states, metropolitan statistical areas, and tribes. For the Dallas-Fort Worth Metropolitan Statistical Area, which is a census term that essentially means 11 counties in the DFW metropolitan area. It does not include Hood County, is the one that's left out of that 11. So for the DFW Metropolitan Statistical Area, there is $1 million in formula funding available to create one regional climate plan for the entire DFW MSA. So that one regional climate plan has to essentially say how local governments within the DFW MSA plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other air pollutants. If the DFW MSA participates and they accept that funding and they create a regional climate plan, they will be made eligible for the second phase of the CPRG, which has $4.6 billion in competitive implementation grants. So those grants can be used to implement the plan that the region develops. The EPA does require that there is one lead applicant for the entire metropolitan statistical area that coordinates the development of the regional plan and that they are responsible for managing the grant funds. Next slide, please. So we, as a North Central Texas Council of Governments, are proposing that we be the lead applicant on behalf of the region. We had a meeting on this on March 30th, 2023, to discuss with our local governments. I know a lot of you were there, so thank you for those who attended, and those of you who weren't able to attend, we do have the slide deck from that day, and then we do have a recording from it, so if you are interested, I can provide that. Thank you, Lori, for putting that in the chat. For the DFW MSA to be eligible for the Phase 2 implementation grant funding, we have to participate in the Phase 1 funding. And to show that we are interested in participating, we would have to submit a notice of intent to participate by April 28th, 2023. So we plan to submit that notice of intent to participate, and we are asking local governments who want to be involved in the development of the plan or who support us in being the lead applicant and developing the plan to submit a letter of support. There is a template letter of support and then instructions on how to submit it available on publicinput.com, which is what Lori put the link in the chat. So if you support us, please submit that letter because it'll be included with our notice of intent to participate that we submit. We plan to, once we get the funding from the EPA to develop the regional climate action plan, we plan to host roughly monthly meetings with our local governments to talk about what's going to be included in the plan and coordinate regional planning. And that is going to start in summer of 2023, most likely after the funding is awarded. Are there any questions about that? Or any questions for Garrett as well? Okay, and I will also provide the template letter of support to Brianne, and she can provide that in the follow-up email that she sends after the webinar. Brianne, can you go to the next slide, please?
Yep.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Savannah and Garrett. And again, if anyone has any questions on any of those funding opportunities, feel free to ask at any time throughout, but also all of our contact information will be at the end of the slides. But for now, we've got about an hour to get into just kind of an open roundtable discussion, kind of guided by these questions on the slide, but really chatting about anything related to these funding opportunities that folks might want some clarification on, want to know what's already going on in the region for these funding opportunities. So first, interested in how is your community planning on utilizing these funds? And then what questions do you have for your communities, for communities that have experience applying to these funds? I see that Catherine, you have your hand up. Do you want to kind of get a little bit into what you were thinking around this conversation?
Yeah, and I can kind of get the ball rolling too on what we're planning to do up here in Denton. So we have used the EECBG program previously. I think it was 2010 timeframe anyway. It's been a minute. We're excited. I'm really excited about the voucher program, and I wanted to put in another plug for the voucher program. There's going to be a webinar on April 13th. There was a link in the presentation to sign up for that. They're still fleshing out what that voucher program is going to look like, but it's going to be a much easier path to use the formula funding than what we had in the past. It is going to give some categories to look at for programs, which I think will help everyone too. And hopefully they flesh that out enough that it's pretty plug and play. I know that we're looking at some additional lighting upgrades for some of our facilities. We have some that have had full LED replacements, and we're going to look at doing both the interior and exterior on a few of our other facilities. We're also going to take that opportunity to go to some dark sky friendly exterior lighting, make sure that we are capturing that. And I think we're also going to be able to look at doing the taxiway lighting at our airport. The runway lighting has been funded through an FAA grant. I believe it's through FAA, sorry. But the taxiways weren't. So I think we're going to use this funding so that they're all in the same replacement cycle, just to make maintenance easier in the long run. But systems upgrades, lighting upgrades, HVAC, those are all eligible projects from what we're reading. Weatherization, I believe, fits into the formula as well. So there's a lot that we can do on our facilities with this funding.
Great, thanks, Kat. Sharon, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, regarding the EECBG program, I know the state's going to get funding, and 60% of that funding has to go out to jurisdictions that were not eligible for allocations. Do you know how that's going to work?
Yeah, so the State Energy Conservation Office will be distributing that funding. Last time we talked to them about that, they didn't have a method for doing that. But we'll be in touch with CECO as they apply for that funding and receive it and find out how they're going to distribute it.
And are you expecting that in like 2024? Because I know the state application isn't due until what, June, July 2024. So it'll be a while, right?
Yeah, it'll probably be another year for the state funding.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Garrett, and thanks, Sharon, for that question. Are there any other cities on the line that already kind of have an idea of what kind of projects they are interested in applying for the EECBG funding? Yeah, if anyone's already kind of thought that through internally and plans on applying.
This is Mindy. Oh, I'm sorry. I just cut in front of people that raise their hand. Is that okay if I go ahead since I'm already
Yeah, you can go ahead, Mindy.
Sorry, y'all. Mindy with the City of Louisville. We've been meeting internally with some of our teams from different departments, our parks department, our facilities, our fleet, and just kind of brainstorming opportunities that would fit in this program, especially that would fit what they've designated the blueprint projects that would be kind of the streamlined options that kind of bump you up in funding faster. Also looking at what might be potentially voucher eligible, again, to streamline with it being such a small allocation, for us, just trying to look at being as efficient as possible. And what we've landed on as a group, one of the problems that we have with some of our parks, we have a number of nature trails that are not accessible in areas that have traditional access to electricity. And so we were looking at potentially doing some sort of solar lighting for our parks trails in these areas for safety reasons. Not out by the lake, but in our middle of our city, we have Central Park that would be eligible for that. And then also looking at potentially putting in some LED upgrades at some of our facilities as well, and using this to capitalize on that opportunity for that.
Great, thanks, Mindy. And I think that you bring up a really good point about folks making sure that you are collaborating and talking to departments from across your city, like facilities and parks folks, to make sure you're capturing kind of all of the opportunities that this funding could be used for. And then I just want to remind folks, I put it in the chat, but if anyone would like, please introduce yourself in the chat and just say what city or organization you're coming from. And then also maybe before, for the folks on the line, if you do want to have make a comment, just introduce yourself briefly before you start speaking, just to provide a little bit of context. So Michael, you've got your hand up. You can feel free to take the floor.
Yeah, thanks. And no problem. I'm usually the worst person about just jumping in instead of raising my hand. I thought I'd be one time I raised my hand and look what it got me, but I'm just kidding. Yeah, so Michael Hamvick, City of Fort Worth, Transportation and Public Works Department. We have been talking internally. We're just kind of starting those conversations. There have been a few conversations. We're actually meeting next week more formally. A lot of the divisions coming together to discuss kind of the next steps. We've been talking about maybe using the funding for planning, for energy efficiency plan going forward. But also we've been talking about traffic signals and also maybe charging stations. So those are kind of things we've been throwing around. We're going to come together and talk about it. One question I guess I had for kind of other organizations or other entities on the line is, yeah, in the last person alluded to it, the voucher versus the grant process or track to take. You know, what's easier? Obviously, the voucher streamlines it, but it looks like it can only be used for certain activities. Just wondering what people think about that. And then before maybe people answer on that, Garrett, question for you. I heard from someone that we anticipate these allocations for several years, the direct allocations to the entities like this. What's your, I didn't hear you say this in your presentation. What's the thoughts on that? Do we expect allocations similar to this in the future? And if so, for how many years? I heard as many as 10 years, which seems odd because I thought maybe it fell within the 5 of the IIJA, but what are your thoughts on that and going forward allocations directly to entities? Thanks.
I can cover the allocations first. I believe what I understood is that would just be through the IIJA, so for the next 5 years, and that the application deadline would be next year, 2024, for the local governments allocated. States have a little longer. And then the competitive process will be a lot longer than the formula funding. So maybe that is the funding that's going to be available longer.
Okay, so you expect 5 years, similar allocation amounts for the length of the IIJA bill. Yeah. Okay, it's a good direction. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Garrett, for answering that. Does anyone else, I know Catherine mentioned it, but does anyone else have any thoughts, or maybe Garrett, if you've looked into this a little bit further about the distinction between the voucher and the grant program, and if folks have kind of thought through which they want to pursue?
I can say that when I have discussed, or I've sent inquiries to the EECBG program admins about the voucher program, their responses have been fairly vague, but they did direct me to attend the upcoming voucher webinar. What I do know is that the voucher option, there's a lot less administrative burden because you won't be applying for a federal grant. But they said that any local governments or anyone allocated funding that already has a process in place to apply for federal funding through federal grant funding, they would encourage them to do that. I understand that the voucher program is more of a rebate, than just receiving the funding like you would with a grant. So it just depends on your local government's preference and abilities. I don't know if anyone has any plans to apply for the voucher instead of the grant.
Thanks again, Garrett. Sasha, if you want to go ahead and speak.
Yeah, as far as what I've read with the voucher and the grant, the voucher seems to be limited to the equipment and technical assistant programs activities. I know that the pre-award document is due, April 28th. And you do have to say if you're doing a grant or a voucher, but you can change that at a later date.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Sasha. It sounds like both options are good. There's kind of pros and cons to each. So it's kind of up to the cities internally to decide depending on what project you want to apply for, and then also what your internal kind of administrative capacity is. If you have more experience with federal grants, you might want to pursue the grant program because it sounds like there's a little bit more flexibility. But if not, the voucher might be a good option for you. And Savannah also just posted in the chat that DOE did recommend in their program kickoff webinar that if you are receiving less than $250,000, you should consider the voucher option. So again, I posted a link a little bit up in the chat, and the link will be in the slides that we send out to a PDF where you can check exactly how much funding your city or county has been allocated. So there are a few cities and also at the county level in our region that have been allocated over $250,000, but DOE is recommending that if you are receiving less than $250,000, you might want to consider the voucher. So thanks for that note, Savannah. Sasha, you still have your hand up. I don't know, did you have another comment or is it just still up from before?
Sorry, no more comment.
No problem. Novella, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Novella with Carrollton. We are beginning to look into this and considering to do LED retrofits for our streetlights. It's something that Engineering and Public Works has had a little bit of trepidation over. They're worried that there are a number of complications in doing that, but we think if we focus, that might be a good way to go. If anyone has a history of that, if you could please reach out or mention any notes right now, that would be very helpful to us. And it would be helpful just to keep hearing how people are using, because this is a small allocation, how people are focusing their funds and what they're thinking about doing.
Kat, I know that you mentioned that Denton had utilized some of this funding before for kind of LED upgrades, or that you're planning to incorporate that into your current funding request. I don't know if you have any more comments on that, or maybe if you are open to it, you can put your information in the chat if folks want to reach out and ask you more questions about how the city of Denton has used this funding in the past.
Yeah, and for some reason I can't get into the chat.
Okay.
I was removed from the chat. So, but yeah, if anyone wants to reach out to me about the LED streetlight program, we have an active program right now through Denton Municipal Electric where we're changing them out. We didn't use EECBG funding for that. We did a few facilities in the past, but yeah, we do have an active streetlight change out program going right now, and I can tell you some of the fun times that you run into doing that.
Is it okay if I can put your email in the chat?
Yeah,
so
that's
folks have
awesome.
that?
Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, no problem. Okay, so it sounds like a few of our cities are already thinking about this and already kind of have plans in place. If anyone else wants to jump in and talk about how they want to use the funds, please feel free, but maybe we can kind of move on. And oh, okay, we've got two hands up, so we will stay on that. Jamie, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Yes, we also had an internal brainstorming session, and we are looking at doing some residential energy conservation rebate programs with some of our residents, and working with our neighborhood services department to do that. So we're kind of still waiting on some upper level management review and approval of our specific idea. But whenever we get there, I'll be happy to share it. But we're hoping to do something for residents.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamie. And then Lori, you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, I was just going to mention for anybody who is thinking about streetlight retrofits, if you're talking about going to LED streetlight retrofits where you would have some kind of latent electricity capacity left in that streetlight, there are some interesting projects where you can add charging, electric vehicle charging to a streetlight that then has some kind of what is now idle, I guess, electrical capacity. City of Dallas Public Works is working on a pilot project on that. I don't know if anybody from Dallas Public Works is on, but if anybody is interested in getting connected with Jacob McCarroll over there, let us know and we can tie you in.
That sounds really cool. I hadn't heard about that. Thanks, Lori. Yeah, people should definitely look into that. Savannah, go ahead.
I was just wondering, because there are a bunch of local governments on the line, has anyone thought about teaming up to fund a project together? Because the DOE does allow that, where each entity would get their own funding, but a project, I guess if there was something that was maybe on city boundary lines, or let's say if everyone wants to do LED lighting retrofits, maybe, you could do a group application and maybe get a discount or something on the project. Has anyone talked about that or considered doing this? I'm just wondering. Lori, go ahead.
This is Kat. Sorry. Go ahead, Lori.
Okay. No, go ahead, Kat.
I haven't approached the county yet, but I have thought about trying to ask Denton County to see if they would be interested in partnering in some of the efficiency upgrades.
Yeah, that's a great opportunity for a city to maybe work with the county and do it together, and maybe you can get a discount that way.
So I will say, and I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself, Lori Clark at North Central Texas COG in the Transportation Department. For any of you who are in Tarrant County, Susan Young, who's the mobility coordinator in Tarrant County, I don't think I see her on this call, but she has inquired with us about anybody in Tarrant County who's planning on doing XYZ projects. And so I know that there's some interest on her part, at least, in seeing if there's some coordination, collaboration opportunities for a joint project. And I believe that those joint projects are only an option under the traditional grant and not the voucher, I believe. So that's something to think about.
They can do it.
Okay.
It's either.
For those of you who were on a different call earlier today talking about electric vehicle charging stations and the charging and fueling infrastructure grant, because you can also do charging stations under EECBG, I just throw out there, is this a different, or is this a simpler way? But I know EECBG doesn't actually offer all that much, looking at some of the costs on charging stations coming in right now. So I'm just throwing that out there in case anybody wants to be like, never mind, COG, don't worry about a proposal. But for those of you who are not on the call earlier today, just heads up, be on the lookout. We will be looking for interest in EV charging stations from local governments to put on your own property. Ideas that are fairly at least half baked, to potentially submit into a federal highways opportunity that is due at the end of May. So it'll be a pretty quick turnaround. Hopefully we'll have something out by the end of next week. Stay tuned. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about there, if you would please put your name and email in the chat so we make sure to add you to the email list for follow-ups there, please do.
Okay. Okay, and I also just posted a link in the chat to the webpage with more information about that charging and fueling infrastructure grant that Lori mentioned. So kind of separate to this conversation, that is something that we've been exploring at the COG. So if you're interested in getting involved with that kind of regional exploration, feel free to reach out to us. Okay.
I do have one more thing on the EECBG program before we move on. Just real quick, I recently got some clarification from the program admins about the reporting requirements for grant recipients. Grant recipients earning less than or receiving less than 250,000 will report biannually. Those receiving more than 250,000 will report quarterly, and that's just like through any other federal grant process. So just a little more information on reporting. We'd received a question about that from a local government. So
Great, thanks, Garrett. So I know we've talked a lot about EECBG, one of the acronyms, the allocated funding. And we can, of course, keep talking about that, but does anyone have any questions or thoughts or comments on some of the other funding opportunities we spoke about this morning, either through the IIJA or the Inflation Reduction Act funding? Okay. My next question is, are there any cities on the line who either have been allocated funding under the I need to figure out what that actual acronym is so I can stop saying it wrong. EECBG, okay. Are there any communities on the line who know that they have allocated funding, but they have no idea where to start, or they're interested in applying to any of these other programs and you just are kind of at a loss or need some support in where to start? Does anyone kind of fall into that bucket and have questions for either us at COG or the other communities on the line for how you can kind of get started, even just having conversations about what projects you might apply to? Everybody already knows what they're going to apply for and has started those conversations.
I have a question to our local governments, and we can do a poll if you guys want or something. One of the requirements for the EECBG, which I think is the worst name, the worst acronym, no one can say it right, is to create an energy efficiency and conservation strategy, or an EECS. And that has to be submitted, I believe, within a year of when you submit your, not called notice of intent to participate, but whenever you tell the DOE that you want the funding. Is anyone concerned about making that? It's a decently long, even though the DOE provided a template. The template's pretty long. Do local governments feel like they are equipped to create that? Do you think you need assistance? You already have one and you're not worried about it at all?
And if you have one, are you willing to share it with your colleagues and with
Yeah, that would
COG?
be good too. If you haven't heard of the EECS, you have to have a description of your goals for increased energy efficiency and conservation. And you have to have a plan for how you're going to achieve those goals. So that's what it needs.
Mendy, do you want to go ahead and say your comment?
Sure. I actually had a comment from the last conversation before Savannah asked that question. So, and I do have a kind of tangential question to that. To answer her question first, though, I was hoping that we might be able to use a lot of what we're reporting and kind of looking at in general for SECO anyway as kind of a template towards that, and just try not to overcomplicate it. Maybe that's too optimistic of me to want to look at it like that, but that was my hope that we could at least use that as a framework for how we're presenting it to them to make it as easy as possible. My question that, or my comment that I was going to provide prior to that, I was going to share a resource with a company, especially for some of these smaller cities that may not have a lot of staff to address some of the like regulatory type of things. If you wind up having a project that has some of the labor requirements where you get into tracking some of those other additional pieces like the Davis-Bacon Act requirements, we have been partnering along with our CDBG team with a consulting firm called Paperwork Consulting, and we just have a PO that's open with them and a professional services agreement, and they're really, really reasonable in terms of their cost, and they actually do that reporting and tracking and monitoring with the external vendor that's doing the actual installation or labor piece of whatever project it is. So it might be a useful service for some cities, especially that have a smaller team that might not have capacity to tackle some of that. So I will drop their website in the chat if that's of interest to people.
Awesome. Thanks, Wendy. Going back to Savannah's comments on the EECS, I'm wondering if would that maybe fall under something that CECO's free technical assistance could maybe support folks and at least kind of helping them, guide them through how to put together that kind of strategy and plan. I don't know, that could be something that folks might ask to CECO if we don't know.
I would definitely inquire with CECO about that, whether or not they're actually going to help develop that strategy. The PEA would be a good resource as you're putting that together. So I would definitely pursue that.
Yeah, Lori.
So just want to share with everybody, as Brianne mentioned at the outset, we have some CECO funding to support some of our work in holding some of these meetings. And so one of the things that we'll be working on as a deliverable under that contract is a white paper on how to go about putting together an energy plan. And now that this energy efficiency conservation strategy is kind of in front of everybody as a EECBG requirement, I think there's probably something that we could do in coordinating with y'all on how do we take a bunch of things that seem to be related, a desire to develop energy plans, the requirement to have an energy efficiency conservation strategy, and your statutory obligation as affected communities under related to local government energy reporting to achieve a 5% year-over-year electricity consumption reduction. Really complicated way of saying you have to every year reduce your electricity consumption 5% as an entity overall. And all of those things to me seem to dovetail together. So as we work on that white paper, we would be hoping that some of y'all would be willing to participate in a working group with us to kind of brainstorm some of those elements. And we will probably be using DOE's EECS template as a jumping off point. So you don't have to raise your hands right now, but just know that we will be looking for working group participants for that. If you do want to raise your hand now, please do so.
You could also just put your name and email in the chat if you want to participate in that.
Yes.
Denton will have someone there.
Perfect.
Probably JT.
Okay. Kat, did you have another comment?
No,
So your hand just went down.
I double clicked.
No problem. Does anyone else have any questions or thoughts on anything that we've covered?
Well, since Lori mentioned the 5% reduction goal, I know that the energy reporting deadline is passed, but the portal to report is still open. And I know I've already talked to several of you about this and you've already submitted your report. If you haven't yet, I would encourage you to do so. It is mandatory, it requires that you report annually as you work to achieve that 5% reduction goal. So that's all I had on that.
Okay. Looks like we've got a lot of folks signing up for the working group, Lori, so that's great. That'll definitely be super helpful as we start to develop that white paper and provide some more resources for folks in developing their energy plans. So great to see. Okay. I know we've got some communities on the line that we haven't heard from yet, and that's totally fine. Happy that you're just sitting in and kind of absorbing everything that we're talking about. But for any communities that haven't kind of spoken up yet and talked about how they might want to utilize any of this funding, especially our kind of smaller communities, do you guys have any thoughts or comments or questions for either us at COG or our other cities on the line? Okay, well, unless anyone has any last final thoughts or comments or wants to open up another conversation, I guess we can adjourn a little early. But as always, all of us here at COG that spoke today, we are here as resources and also to just connect folks. So if anyone on the line wants to get connected to other folks on the line that spoke up and said something interesting or talked about a project that their city did that you'd love to replicate, either we can help connect you to them or I'm sure everyone's open to being reached out to and being a resource for other cities in our region. So this slide is just some links to our programmatic web pages. The RISE Coalition that I mentioned was really supportive of this conversation today and does a lot of work around connecting communities in the region through sustainability. We've also got some email lists you can join to stay informed. And then here is my information and also Garrett's information if you have further questions for us following the meeting. And as I mentioned, the recording of this will be posted online and also all of the slides. So you'll have access to all of the links that we shared. So with that, thank you all for joining us and have a great rest of your afternoon and have a great weekend.
Yeah, thanks, Brianne, for helping put all this together. We appreciate y'all.
Thanks.
Thank you, Savannah and Garrett, for lending your expertise.
I don't know if I'd call it expertise, but you know, I'm sorry I went so fast.
That's a Friday afternoon, right?